The psychological cost of panic. Panic rarely begins with the situation itself. It begins inside the mind when uncertainty collides with the human instinct for immediate control. Most people assume that chaos causes panic, but the deeper truth is that panic arises when the mind refuses to tolerate uncertainty. In moments of pressure, the brain begins searching desperately for answers, and when those answers do not appear quickly, emotion takes control of the decision-making process. This shift happens faster than most people realize. The human mind is designed to react quickly to perceived threats. When something unexpected happens, financial uncertainty, social conflict, sudden change, the brain interprets the situation as a potential danger. In response, emotional systems activate before rational thought has time to fully analyze what is happening. Heart rate rises, attention narrows, and the mind begins searching for signals that confirm how serious the situation might be. At this point, a subtle but powerful psychological pattern begins to unfold. Instead of evaluating the situation independently, most people begin observing the reactions of those around them. If others appear calm, the mind interprets the situation as manageable, but if others appear alarmed, anxious, or confused, the brain immediately interprets those reactions as evidence of danger. This is how panic spreads through groups. Fear becomes contagious. In environments where uncertainty is high, individuals stop relying on their own reasoning and begin mirroring the emotional signals of the crowd. One person raises their voice, another expresses urgency, and suddenly the entire atmosphere becomes tense. The problem itself may still be unclear, but the emotional reaction has already taken control of the room. What most people fail to recognize is that panic does not improve clarity. In fact, it does the opposite. When the brain enters a heightened emotional state, cognitive capacity begins to narrow. The mind becomes focused on immediate reaction rather than thoughtful evaluation. Information is processed more quickly but less accurately. The individual becomes reactive instead of analytical. This is why people often make their worst decisions during moments of collective panic. They move too quickly. They interpret incomplete information as final truth. They adopt the urgency of others without questioning whether that urgency is justified. In psychological terms, the mind stops thinking strategically and starts thinking defensively. The environment begins to control the individual. When emotional momentum takes over a group, people rarely stop to question the source of the tension they are experiencing. Instead, they unconsciously absorb it. The room becomes louder, movements become faster, and conversations become more reactive. Every individual begins feeding the emotional atmosphere that everyone else is responding to. And yet, within that chaos, something interesting happens. Occasionally there is one person who does not immediately join the emotional momentum. They pause before reacting. They observe rather than imitate. Their posture remains calm even as others begin to accelerate their responses. At first, this difference may appear subtle, almost invisible, but psychologically, it represents a completely different way of processing reality. Instead of allowing emotion to dictate interpretation, this person allows observation to guide reaction. They notice the tension around them, but they do not internalize it. They recognize urgency in the voices of others, but they do not automatically accept that urgency as truth. Their mind remains in a state of analysis rather than emotional contagion. This mental distance is where clarity begins. By refusing to immediately absorb the emotional reactions of others, the mind gains space to evaluate what is actually happening. Instead of reacting to the atmosphere of panic, the individual begins examining the facts within the situation itself. Questions replace assumptions. Observation replaces imitation. Most people never reach this stage because they are too quickly pulled into the emotional rhythm of the group. The brain naturally seeks alignment with its environment. It wants to respond in ways that match the reactions of those nearby. But when someone deliberately slows their response and resists the emotional pressure around them, something remarkable happens. The noise of panic begins to separate from the information within the situation. Suddenly, patterns become visible. Details that were previously hidden behind urgency begin to emerge. While others are reacting to fear, the observer is examining cause and consequence. While others are searching for immediate relief from anxiety, the observer is searching for understanding. This difference in mental posture creates a quiet psychological advantage. Not because the calm individual possesses more intelligence than the others in the room, but because their mind remains available for thinking while others have surrendered theirs to emotional momentum. The quiet advantage of the unshaken mind. In moments of chaos, most people believe speed is the solution. The environment becomes loud, reactions become immediate, and the pressure to respond quickly begins to dominate every interaction. Urgency spreads through conversations like a rising tide. People speak faster, move faster, and make decisions faster, believing that rapid action will restore stability to the situation. Yet beneath this instinct lies a psychological paradox that few recognize. The faster the emotional pace becomes, the less clearly most people are able to think. When panic enters a situation, the mind begins prioritizing relief over understanding. The primary goal is no longer clarity, but escape from discomfort. This subtle shift changes the entire way individuals interpret information. Instead of examining evidence carefully, they look for immediate signals that promise resolution. Quick answers become more attractive than accurate ones. This is why panic often produces collective confusion. When several people in the same environment begin reacting emotionally, their reactions reinforce each other. One person's urgency validates the next person's fear. The tension multiplies until the entire atmosphere becomes saturated with anxious energy. Conversations stop revolving around thoughtful evaluation and start revolving around emotional reassurance. In these moments, something important disappears from the room: silence. Silence is the space where reflection occurs. It is the pause that allows information to settle before interpretation begins. But panic rarely tolerates silence. It fills every gap with noise, speculation, and impulsive conclusions. The mind begins to believe that constant activity equals control. But control does not come from activity, it comes from perception, and perception requires stillness. When a person remains emotionally steady in the middle of collective urgency, their mind begins operating differently from everyone around them. While others are attempting to escape uncertainty through rapid reaction, the calm individual becomes capable of observing the situation as it unfolds. This difference creates a powerful psychological contrast. Where others see confusion, the calm observer begins to see patterns. Where others react to every piece of new information with emotional intensity, the composed mind evaluates how each piece of information fits into a larger structure. Panic fragments attention. Clarity organizes it. The person who remains calm does not become immune to pressure. They feel the same uncertainty, hear the same voices, and witness the same tension unfolding around them. The difference lies in what they choose to do with that pressure. Instead of allowing emotion to compress their thinking, they create internal distance from the environment. This distance is not physical, it is psychological. By refusing to absorb the emotional tempo of the room, the calm thinker protects the clarity of their own reasoning. They do not reject the seriousness of the situation, but they resist the urge to react purely because others are reacting. This restraint preserves their ability to see what others miss. And what others miss during panic is often the simplest truth. Most crises are not solved through emotional intensity, they are solved through clear interpretation of reality. But interpretation requires patience. It requires the willingness to observe details that others rush past. It requires the ability to remain mentally stable long enough for patterns to emerge. Panic interrupts this process by forcing the mind into a constant state of urgency. When someone refuses to participate in that urgency, their presence begins to stand out. In environments where everyone is reacting quickly, the calm individual appears almost unusual. Their slower pace may initially be misunderstood as hesitation or indifference. Others may interpret their composure as a lack of concern. But gradually something becomes visible. Their thinking remains organized. While others move from one reaction to another, the calm observer begins constructing a clearer understanding of the situation. They notice connections that panic prevents others from seeing. They recognize which information is meaningful and which reactions are simply emotional echoes of the crowd. Over time, this clarity changes how others respond to them. People naturally search for stability when they feel overwhelmed. In a room filled with anxiety, the individual who remains composed becomes psychologically significant. Their calm presence signals that it is still possible to think clearly, not through force, not through control, but through restraint. The quiet mind becomes the rarest resource in chaotic environments, and because it is rare, it becomes powerful. The unshaken mind does not dominate chaos, it simply refuses to be shaped by it. Discipline before reaction. The most dangerous moment in any crisis does not occur when the problem first appears. It occurs a few seconds later, when the mind experiences its first emotional impulse to react. That impulse is fast, automatic, and deeply rooted in human psychology. It pushes the individual toward immediate action, often before the mind has fully understood what is actually happening. In that brief window between stimulus and response, most people lose control of their thinking. The brain is designed to prioritize survival, and in uncertain situations it interprets ambiguity as potential danger. When the brain senses danger, emotional systems activate immediately. The body prepares for action, attention narrows, and the mind begins searching for the fastest possible response. This process happens so quickly that it often feels like instinct rather than choice. But instinct is not always clarity. In fact, in complex situations, instinct can become the very thing that clouds judgment. When individuals react instantly, they rarely give themselves enough time to separate facts from emotional signals. The mind responds to urgency rather than understanding. This is where discipline becomes essential. Most people assume discipline means pushing themselves harder or acting with greater determination. In reality, one of the most powerful forms of discipline is restraint. It is the ability to slow the mind down when every emotional signal is encouraging speed. It is the ability to resist the first impulse and allow thought to form before action begins. This restraint creates something rare in moments of pressure: space. Space between the event and the reaction. Within that space, something important happens. The emotional surge that initially overwhelms the mind begins to settle. The body stabilizes. The intensity of the moment becomes less consuming. Instead of reacting to the shock of the situation, the individual begins to observe the situation itself. Most people never allow this space to exist. They move from stimulus to reaction without interruption. Someone speaks loudly, and they respond with equal urgency. A sudden problem appears, and they rush to fix it before fully understanding it. Their actions feel productive, but in reality they are being guided by emotional momentum rather than deliberate reasoning. This pattern repeats itself in many environments. In workplaces, conversations, financial decisions, and personal conflicts, the speed of reaction often determines the direction of the outcome. When people react emotionally, they escalate situations rather than clarify them. Words are spoken too quickly. Decisions are made without full awareness of their consequences. The disciplined mind interrupts this cycle. It does not attempt to eliminate emotion completely. Emotion is part of human perception and often provides valuable signals. But the disciplined mind refuses to allow emotion to become the sole driver of action. Instead, it introduces a pause that allows thinking to re-enter the process. This pause may only last a few seconds, but its impact is profound. When the mind pauses, it regains access to parts of cognition that panic often suppresses. Analytical thinking begins to function again. The individual starts noticing details that were previously overshadowed by urgency. Patterns emerge where confusion once dominated. The situation itself does not necessarily change, but the way it is perceived changes dramatically. Where others see only immediate pressure, the disciplined observer begins to see structure. They recognize which elements of the situation require attention, and which elements are simply emotional noise generated by the environment. This distinction is what allows clarity to emerge. Over time, practicing this restraint transforms the way the mind processes stress. Instead of automatically reacting to pressure, the individual becomes accustomed to creating a moment of stillness before responding. This stillness becomes a form of mental boundary. It protects the quality of thought from the emotional turbulence of the environment. Gradually, a psychological shift occurs. The person no longer feels compelled to match the pace of everyone around them. They are comfortable allowing others to react quickly while they continue observing. Their thinking becomes less influenced by the urgency of the room, and more guided by their own internal rhythm. This internal rhythm becomes the foundation of clear thinking. It allows the mind to operate independently, even when surrounded by emotional pressure. It prevents the individual from being swept into the collective reactions that often dominate chaotic situations. And as this discipline strengthens, the person begins to experience something that most people rarely achieve during moments of crisis: the ability to think with precision while everyone else is still reacting. The authority of the clear mind. There is a moment that eventually appears in the development of a disciplined mind, and it does not arrive through sudden realization or dramatic transformation. It emerges slowly through repeated situations where the individual chooses clarity over reaction. Over time, these moments accumulate until a deeper psychological shift begins to form. The person no longer experiences chaos in the same way others do. The environment may still become tense, voices may rise, urgency may spread through the room as people search for answers or attempt to regain control of the situation. But inside the mind of someone who has practiced restraint and observation, the experience feels different. Instead of becoming absorbed by the emotional atmosphere, they begin to see it from a distance. This distance is not physical, it is psychological detachment. When a person detaches from the emotional momentum of a group, they regain something that panic often removes from everyone else's perspective. While others are reacting to immediate pressure, the detached mind begins examining the broader structure of what is happening. Patterns that were hidden inside the chaos begin to appear. The reactions of others become information rather than instructions. This shift changes the way the individual interprets situations. Instead of treating every emotional signal as something that demands a response, they begin observing those signals as part of the environment itself. A raised voice becomes a clue about stress rather than a trigger for escalation. A sudden decision by others becomes an event to analyze rather than something to imitate. The calm observer becomes aware of something that most people overlook. Chaos has a rhythm. In moments of collective panic, reactions tend to follow predictable patterns. First comes uncertainty, then emotional amplification, then rapid decision-making driven by urgency rather than clarity. When someone is no longer participating in that emotional rhythm, they can begin recognizing its structure. This recognition creates a quiet advantage, because while others are attempting to solve the problem by reacting faster, the calm thinker begins identifying the forces that are shaping the situation itself. They notice who is driving the emotional intensity, where misinformation might be spreading, and which decisions are being made purely out of fear. Understanding replaces reaction, and understanding naturally produces influence. Not the loud, forceful kind of influence that demands attention, but the quiet authority that emerges when a person demonstrates consistent clarity in difficult moments. When people are overwhelmed, they instinctively look for stability. They look for someone whose thinking appears grounded, even when the environment is unstable. Over time, the person who remains calm during pressure becomes that reference point. Others begin paying attention to their words, because those words do not carry the same emotional turbulence that dominates the rest of the room. Their responses appear measured rather than rushed. Their decisions appear deliberate rather than reactive. This is how authority quietly forms, not through status titles or loud confidence, but through the repeated demonstration of psychological stability. The individual becomes known for their ability to think when others are overwhelmed. Their presence gradually changes the dynamics of situations, because people begin to trust the clarity of their perception. But the real transformation occurs internally. The individual no longer experiences chaos as something that must immediately be controlled or eliminated. Instead, they begin seeing it as an environment that reveals information. Panic exposes weaknesses in systems. Urgency exposes the habits of individuals. Confusion exposes where understanding is missing. Where others see disorder, the clear mind begins to see structure. And because it sees structure, it can respond with precision rather than emotion. Eventually, a quiet realization begins to take shape within the mind of someone who has developed this level of clarity. They recognize that the true advantage was never about controlling chaos itself. Chaos will always exist in different forms: economic pressure, social conflict, uncertainty about the future. The real advantage lies in something much quieter: the ability to remain mentally independent from the emotional storms that move through the world around them. And when a person reaches that level of independence, they discover that the greatest form of control was never about changing the behavior of others. It was about protecting the clarity of their own mind, while everything else around them begins to panic.